David Norgrove is the protector of the wealth of millions of us. As chairman of the pensions regulator, his job is to make sure that company pension schemes have the resources to honour their promises to current and future pensioners. On this week's Leading Questions, I ask him how much havoc has been wreaked on our savings by the credit crunch and whether defined benefit pension schemes that guarantee an income to us in retirement face total extinction. David Norgrove, I don't mean this in a sort of unflattering sense, but you're probably not a particularly famous public figure in this country, but perhaps you ought to be, because it's difficult to think of an individual who, in a sense, is more important to people's savings, people's wealth. There you are, broadly trying to make sure that pension schemes honour their obligations and pay people what they've saved in their retirement. Does it feel like a particularly burdensome, onerous responsibility?
Well, I certainly take it seriously, but it isn't just me, of course. There's a very fine chief executive and 300 people in Brighton trying to look after 60,000 pension schemes. And I think doing, people think, a pretty good job at it.
We've seen, over a period of years, the closure of final salary schemes to new members. We're increasingly now seeing some schemes simply refusing to let existing members make a contribution. Is this the end of the final salary scheme? Is this the end of the great British tradition of companies providing schemes to their employees where the employees can be more or less 100% confident what they're going to get when they retire?
I wouldn't say it's the end. I mean, it has been a system that's been in decline for much longer than people think. The number of people in final salary schemes peaked in 1967 and has been declining ever since. So it is a long-term decline, but I think that there's a good chance that we'll see a core of companies continuing to offer final salary schemes, particularly big companies. I mean, for example, Tesco are very committed to it, as I understand it, and Barclays have not closed their scheme entirely. They've adopted a kind of hybrid scheme.
I mean, for many years, our final salaries pension schemes looked to be an absolutely wonderful thing. We had the private sector providing a safety net, and there was, as a result of that, much less burden on the state.
Yeah.
Now we have been through a period where stock markets have plunged. Economic conditions in the world in general are as bad as they've been. Well, most people think since the 1930s in some measures. How much of a crisis has this been for pension schemes?
I think it's very difficult. It is going to take quite a long time to work this through. Again, it does depend a lot what happens in the next few years. The good thing about pension schemes is that by and large they're a very slow matter. This isn't like the banking system that can collapse overnight. Clearly companies can go under quite quickly, but generally speaking, if the sponsoring company stays in business, there's time to sort this out. It's not something that has to be done immediately.
Now, a really difficult judgment for you is in determining what companies should do, what action they should take when the deficit between their assets and their liabilities widen. And obviously for lots of companies in the current crisis, that deficit has widened very significantly. How difficult is it to make the judgment about essentially whether it's sensible to force companies to make big additional contributions immediately to top up that hole versus the potential damage that can be done to those companies at a time of recession by saying to them, you've got this huge equivalent of a debt that you've got to honour now. Plainly, most pension fund members would think, killing the company in order to save the fund doesn't really save the fund.
No.
How difficult is all of that?
I think that's the core part of the job, and it's a core part of the job of the trustees of the pension schemes. 130,000 trustees out there trying to do this, and it's not easy. I do think we've made some progress over the last few years. I mean, the changes in legislation 4 or 5 years ago made it clear that the pension scheme is a creditor of the company. It's an unsecured creditor. And trustees have had to learn how to manage that new understanding, really. And I think, by and large, they're striking the right kind of balance at the moment. What we've said is very clearly, as you've said too, that a viable sponsor is the best protection for members of pension schemes. What we've then said is there's flexibility in how long companies can take to make up a deficit, provided that the level of liability is assessed prudently in the first place.
How worried are you about the pressures on manufacturing companies at the moment from this credit, this large debt that they've got to their pension schemes?
Well, it is clearly an issue, a serious issue for some of them, because many manufacturing companies were very large, accumulated large pension schemes, and have since shrunk. So we do look very carefully at those kinds of companies, but other companies too, as not just in manufacturing. I wouldn't single out manufacturing above all others. And we have looked at and modelled the economy as a whole to try to see what effect this is likely to have on business generally through looking at cash flows. And it's not easy to come to absolutely firm conclusions, but the evidence seems to be that it still remains the case that for most companies this is a manageable issue. But there's a minority for which it's going to be very difficult.
So you think we may see more collapses, more transfers of funds into the Pension Protection Fund?
Well, inevitably in a serious recession we're going to see more companies go insolvent. But I don't think at the moment we see this as a crisis. It's one of those pressures, but it looks at this stage to be manageable.
And in terms of the resources of the Pension Protection Fund, the sort of insurance scheme for the industry, the scheme that picks up the bill when a pension fund does collapse, are those resources adequate?
Well, of course, they do a lot of modelling of what the prospect might hold for them. They're not a pension scheme, and they do have the ability to tax companies. So they have escape valves which other people don't. And from that point of view, I think they're reasonably confident.
Now, if you are in a pension scheme at the moment, do you think that you can take any comfort from the size of the scheme? Would your view be that bigger schemes are more or less likely to fail than smaller schemes?
It's hard to know at the moment. I mean, clearly there are some very large schemes that are under pressure, but by and large schemes are better funded than smaller schemes on average. And of course they tend to be better managed because they've got the resources to employ professionals to look after them.
I mean, over the past 25 years we've moved from a world of sort of financial paternalism where people joined a company, stayed there most of their lives, put some money into a pension scheme. Sometimes they didn't even have to. Sometimes the company itself made the entire contribution, and everybody was confident at the end of the day there'd be a nice pension for them when they retired. Now, we've moved away from that world. Fewer companies provide that kind of rather attractive savings vehicle. But at the same time, this move towards giving more responsibility for individuals hasn't really been accompanied by any great education of people about how to make really quite difficult decisions about how to save for the long term, how to save for retirement. How concerned are you that people just don't actually have either the knowledge or the skills to make these hugely important decisions about where to save and how much to save?
No, I think that's a real issue. I mean, the evidence is that people generally are frightened of saving for pensions. They think that pensions are very complicated. Actually, pensions in many ways are quite simple once you've made the initial decision. You can, if you do it at a young enough age, you can let it run. You need to keep an eye on it from time to time, but it gets overcomplicated in the way that it's explained. I mean, the FSA have a program now running to try to improve financial education, but there's a long way to go with that.
I might want to pick you up on that just for a second. One of the things that created these, or the perception of these big deficits in many pension funds, was that all of a sudden actuaries woke up one day and said, crikey, we've just got these expectations of how long people are going to live completely wrong. To what extent should we blame the actuaries for failing to keep up with what science was frankly telling us about what was happening to people? We were all living longer.
I think actuaries have accepted responsibility there and are now putting in a lot more effort into making more realistic projections of longevity. It's an inherently extremely difficult thing to do. The trouble is that each stage when we've projected, we've said well, it's going to carry on at the same rate for the next few years and then it'll tail off. But it's like a sort of fox's tail. At each stage it goes on and then it tails off, and we're still in that situation. I think it's much more prudent to assume at the moment that there's no end to the rate of increase in life expectancy.
Over the past 15, 20 years, it's become quite normal for people to retire at 60, draw a pension at 60, in a rather famous, notorious case of a well-known banker. He's been drawing his pension at the age of 50. To what extent is it going to be remotely affordable, either for individual schemes or for the country, to have people retiring as young as 60, for example? Is the retirement age, and more importantly in your case, the age at which you receive your pension, going to have to go up significantly?
Undoubtedly. I mean, life expectancy is rising for a 45-year-old man at the moment by about 6 hours a day, which is just extraordinary. But it's not just for 45-year-olds. Life expectancy has been rising for everybody now for decades. So people are going to have to work longer, partly because we're not going as a nation to save as much for retirement as we did in the past.
What would you guess, if you had to guess, where do you think the age at which we'll start drawing pensions, where would it settle? 70? Older than 70?
Well, tell me how long this rate of increase is going to carry on, but it's certainly, the government's recent legislation is increasing the state retirement age progressively to 68. I think it'll end up higher than that.
In the round, because of the way that you measure the future liabilities of pension funds, when bond prices go up, actually, the holes in pension funds get worse. Are we therefore using the right kind of techniques to assess really how big those holes in pension funds are?
I think so. I mean, people disagree about this. Intelligent people disagree. It's not straightforward. But the way I think about it is that in practice what you're trying to do is to make a series of liabilities that goes out possibly 100 years and bring them back to a number today. Now, in thinking about that, what you've got to think about is how much money you need to invest to deliver that cash that's going to be paid out over the next century. If bond prices are going up and yields are going down, the amount of money that you've got invested is going to earn less. So it's going to earn less over that next 100 years than it would have done before. So in a sense, you've got to put more money in, and that's showing how much more money you've got to put in.
We saw 2 or 3 years ago the growth of this new industry. Specialist insurance companies were created, Paternoster, the Pensions Corporation, and they were created in order to in a sense, buy out pension schemes from companies, to take off companies the responsibility for funding these pensions. In your view, was that a healthy development?
Some and some, I think. We came across about 25 of these operations. Some of them were regulated by the FSA and were proposing to take on pension schemes in the same way that an insurance company would take on a pension scheme, with lots of capital backing them up in case something went wrong. Others were proposing to take on a pension scheme where it was heads we win, tails you lose. There was too much risk staying with the pension scheme and too much benefit staying with the buyout company. And on that basis, we urged the government to take legislation to allow us to stop that, and I think in practice we have.
What kind of future do you think there is for these sorts of buyouts? Do you think that was a sort of temporary phenomenon that actually won't be sustained, or do you think there is a long-term future for these kinds of transfers from companies to these specialist vehicles?
Well, I hope and believe that the ones that aren't regulated by the FSA are in practice at an end. But the ones that are regulated by the FSA and are properly backed by capital, I think that's a desirable outcome. In most cases, then, it would be good for pensioners or members of pension scheme if their scheme transfers to one that's got that amount of capital behind it.
You've had a couple of big changes in your career, as it were. I mean, you've tended to do pretty long stints and then done really quite different things after a while, as it were.
Yeah.
I mean, you started off in the Treasury.
Yeah.
How did you end up there?
Via history and then wanting to become an economist, and the Treasury were the only people who'd give me a a scholarship to go off and study economics. So actually my first job, or proper job, was in 1970 in the Treasury, working as a holiday job, working on pensions reform.
Is that right?
Yes.
That's a curious coincidence, as it were.
Yeah.
And then were you around during, the great sort of IMF funding crisis?
I was.
And were you in the right bit of the Treasury at that point?
Well, I was I was responsible for relations at the IMF when we went to borrow from them. So that was an exciting time.
That must have been. And do you see any sort of parallels between now and then?
No, I mean, I think that the way that the financial markets work now is so different, and the way that governments relate to the financial markets, I don't think we're in anywhere near the same situation.
Now, you also worked as private secretary to Margaret Thatcher for a bit.
Yeah.
What was that like?
Well, it's sort of 9 o'clock in the morning till 10 o'clock at night or 11 o'clock at night every day. So it was demanding on family life, but unmissable. I mean, she is a remarkable woman. I mean, I didn't necessarily agree with everything she did, but the more I look back on it, the more I realise what an astonishing leader she was.
Was she in some ways the most impressive person you've worked with?
I think so. Yes, I mean, a person of world stature.
And you went from there to Marks and Spencer, which was a big leap. How did that come about?
I'd worked in the late 70s in a bank in the US, in First National Bank of Chicago in Chicago, and really enjoyed being in the private sector. And I wanted to go back into the private sector after number 10, and M&S offered me a job.
I mean, is that because you'd come across Derek Rayner or something?
No, I'd come across some headhunters who were working for him, and they put me in his way.
And they didn't insist that you had to behave like an economist. You actually went off and sort of ran real bits of the business, didn't you?
I did, yes. No, I ran the European business, and I bought menswear, and I ran the clothing business for a bit.
Was that fun?
Yeah, no, I loved it. No, I really enjoyed the visiting the shops and the fabrics and the colours, and very different from dealing with interest rates.
Yes, very.
Yes. So carrying Mrs. Thatcher's handbag to selling trousers.
No, I mean, you're obviously removed and have been for many years from M&S. One of the things, however, I just wondered if you thought, one of the things that is, I find odd in a way, is that it does lurch, has done over the past 15 years, from boardroom crisis to boardroom crisis. They do seem, whether it was organising the succession to Rick Greenbury, or organising the succession to Luc van der Velde, or now organising the succession to Stuart Rose, they do seem to have a knack of doing it spectacularly badly. Do you have, as somebody who worked there for a long time, do you have any sense of why this particular company seems cursed in this respect?
I don't know. I mean, retailing's quite an emotional business. It's a trading business. It's a bit like, I traded foreign exchange for a bit, and it reminded me of that. So it attracts quite emotional kinds of people, and maybe it's something to do with that. I mean, it's a major retail business, and actually to do with clothing too. Clothing is so touchy-feely. It attracts people of that kind. Maybe that's something to do with it, but I don't really know.
Do you think of yourself as a very emotional person?
Sometimes, yes. Yes.
Where does it manifest itself? At the Emirates when you're watching Arsenal?
Yeah, certainly. I'm on my feet there quite a lot. Yeah. No.
Now, the other big thing that you've taken on as pensions regulator is preparing for the launch of this great new national pension savings scheme, I think in 2012, where all companies at that stage will be obliged to automatically enrol their employees into a pension scheme unless the employees choose to opt out. And also, indeed, the companies will be obliged to pay 3% of earnings into the scheme. How prepared are we? I mean, 2012 isn't that far away any longer. Do you think we're on track for that? I
think so. I mean, we've had a lot of people crawl over our preparations for this and come out saying, yes, actually, you're well on track. I mean, it is a big task. We've got to register 1.1 million employers, not in one go. I mean, it will be spread out over a period, and then check auto-enrollment. But I think we've got a very capable team doing that, and we'll be ready.
Do you think the nearer we get to 2012, the more there's a likelihood that pressures will build up to delay the launch of the scheme for fear that particularly smaller companies simply won't be able to afford it?
Well, I suppose it's possible, but two things. It is still 3 years away, and it is going to be phased in with a gradual increase in contributions. It's not all at once. So we're talking here up to 6 years, and I would hope that within 6 years we'll be able to afford that. It's a poor look out if we can't.
One of the things that employers say to me that frustrates them is that here you are telling them that their pension schemes are a genuine debt, and it is a debt that they have to service and honour. And at the same time, in the public sector, there are huge commitments to millions and millions of public sector employees, and yet the government is allowed broadly to delay making provision of a serious sort for these people as long as the government likes. Is it unfair?
Well, I mean, we've always had unfunded schemes, haven't we? Where, for example, for civil servants, where there are no assets behind the scheme. It comes out of the tax pot each year, the amount that's being paid to pensioners. So that's no different. And of course, the more that funded schemes become unfunded because the deficits increase, they're moving towards pay-as-you-go schemes where the cash that goes out of the scheme is met by cash coming in. So I don't think, in principle, that's wrong, but it's a matter for politicians now to think about how far that's going to be affordable in the future, and also for employees in the public sector to, over time, work out how much pay they're prepared to give up to maintain very good pensions.
I mean, is your view that the public sector can afford to continue to pay final salary schemes on this scale?
Well, the tax, they're funded out of tax in the end, so in principle, that's always possible.
But are we right to, in a sense, heap on the economy this potential for a much higher tax burden if we are going to honour all of these?
I don't want to pick out the public sector in particular. I do think there's an issue that my generation is being paid for by, if I can put it this way, your generation. We've had everything. We've had house prices rising very fast. We've got, many of us, very good final salary pension schemes. We've had free university education. We've had full employment throughout our careers, by and large. Our generation has done very well, and now we're going to be paid for by your generation.
And so do you have a view as to how under natural justice one can...
Well, I think there's a real issue there that could well be with us for the next 30 years, and I look forward to seeing how it plays out.
David Norgrove, many thanks indeed.
Right. Thank you.